Hi, and welcome to the latest improvements to PKCS 11 briefing. We're so glad that you're with us today. A couple quick announcements before we get started. Please note that this webinar is being recorded. We will send a follow-up email with a link, hopefully this afternoon. Feel free to submit questions during the briefing, and we will take them at the end if there's time to do so. But don't worry if we don't answer your question, we will record it and send a follow-up email. So that's pretty much it. And with that, what I'd like to do is introduce our two speakers, the first of which is Tony Cox. He is the PKCS 11 Technical Committee Co-Chair, and he is a VP Partner Alliance and Standards at Cryptsoft. And Bob Relia, also he is the PKCS TC Co-Chair and Principal Software Engineer at Red Hat. And with that, Tony, would you take it over?
Happy to. Thank you, Dee. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. So folks, welcome to the latest improvements in PKCS 11, making cryptographic integrations even easier. As said, my name's Tony Cox. I've got with me our co-chair, Bob Relia. So as far as content for today's webinar, I've got a brief introduction for myself and Bob. We will get into the development timeline of the PKCS 11 series of documents, certainly just within the OASIS timeframe. We'll discuss what's coming in PKCS 11 version 3.0, or sorry, what's out in PKCS 11 version 3.0 that was out earlier in the year, as well as the implementations that are deploying elements of that in their shipping products, before we get on to what's coming in version 3.1 and then version 3.2 of the standard before we move to some questions. As far as introductions go, like I said, my name's Tony Cox. I'm the VP Partners Alliances and Standards at Cryptsoft. Before I became involved with OASIS, my previous work included authentication work, identity management, and PKI deployments. I'm currently serving as the OASIS PKCS 11 co-chair, as previously mentioned. I also co-chair some individuals at the KMIP Technical Committee, as well as the Security Access and Methods Technical Committee. And for the last 8 or 9 years, I've also run the KMIP interoperability test events that we've had across the years, basically working to improve the interoperability between products and implementations that implement the KMIP standard. That'll become relevant later on in the discussion. Over to you, Bob.
Yeah, so I'm Bob Relia. I'm the principal software engineer here at Red Hat. I've been a longtime NSS developer since my early Netscape days in 1996. I've worked for IBM, Netscape, iPlanet, AOL, Red Hat, and now Red Hat is part of IBM again, so I've come full circle. I'm currently part of the Red Hat crypto team, which is responsible for the core crypto libraries in the NSS in the Red Hat enterprise operating systems. So we're responsible for NSS, OpenSSL, GNU TLS, and we're directly responsible for all the crypto in Red Hat. Even though we may not be managing the packages, we actually keep our thumbs on all the different crypto. And I'm also the OASIS PKCS 11 chair. Okay. There we go. So PKCS 11, from OASIS perspective, PKCS 11 came to OASIS in 2015, and we got version 2.4 out. PKCS 11 had a history before that under RSA, but it had a fairly long hiatus between 2.2 and 2.40. So in March, we released, March 2015, we released the first 2.40 spec. We had a errata in May. And then we just, this June, we recently released 3.0, and we're expecting to keep a better cadence now and release 3.1 in this next year. So. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on with PKCS 11 V3. So what's new in V3.0? Well, part of the reason we created it as 3.30 is we added a new interface for fetching our calls, function calls. So PKCS 11 has an interface to get the function table that lists all the functions that PKCS 11 supports. And in 3.0, we created a whole bunch of new functions for the first time in about 20 years. So it turns out that created problems for vendors because vendors added vendor-specific functions at the end of their function table. So they wouldn't be able to add V3 support to those that existing function table without causing problems with their existing applications. So we now have a new interface, and that interface, you pass it a string that tells you what particular function table you want, whether you want a PKCS 11 version 2 or version 3. The interfaces are also versioned. And there's also a specification, part of the specification now says how vendors can fetch their own function tables so that they won't collide with our spec or with other vendors. Also in that new function interface, we also allow you to fetch functions that have a function table has slightly different semantics. Currently, we defined a new semantic that makes fork work better in PKCS 11 modules. So the current 2.0 spec says if you fork your PKCS 11 module, then the application is responsible for creating a new init, and that everything else is undefined if you try to make calls into that PKCS 11 module after a fork. Now you can set a flag that says, I want a fork safe interface, and the PKCS 11 module is responsible for making sure anything that it has to do across a fork survives properly. So for a software module, it's usually nothing, but for hardware modules, they have to worry about dealing with the fork handles and things like that. The reason we have a new fetching interface is because we actually have new functional interfaces. The main new functional interface is our message-based crypto. So we have a whole set of functions to handle encryption, decryption, message, or verify and sign, where we need to pass additional information that wasn't in the default on each update call. And this was, am I still on? Tony, give me a thumbs up. Okay, good. I just got a notice from Zoom, so I'm fine. Okay. Anyway, so the we need to pass parameters to function specific or mechanism specific parameters to each of the different update calls for algorithms like AEAD. So this was driven by the fact that we needed to support AES GCM, and GCM needed to return the IV on each call or take a new IV coming in. And so to support AEAD functions in 2.0, we had this, we had to just do them as single shot operations. So now we have the ability to open a, create an init and then do update, and then do each of the different blocks from GCM and get all the right IDs and get the right return tags and all that other stuff in line, and we can control returning the IV based on the key and making sure that we're not returning the same IV for the same key on two different blocks. We also took this opportunity to add some functions that we've needed but hadn't added because it required adding functions. So user login. So you can now add a username we have a new login call that you can add a username when you log in. And we have a function that allows you to cancel outstanding operations. So before, the only way to cancel an operation is to call the finalize function. And now we have a function that allows you to cancel multiple operations at once. So if things are wonky on your token, you can go in and cancel those without having to complete an actual operation. We've added new mechanisms like we do in every release of PKCS 11. AES XTS, SHA-3, including the Shake PRF that comes with SHA-3. And we've added message-based definitions for AES GCM and CCM. We had them defined before, but they were only single shot. And now the spec specifies how they interact in the new message-based protocols. We've also added some new KDF functions. SP856A defines a bunch of a couple KDFs, which we've now defined. SP800-108 is a flexible KDF, so they're parameterized. So pretty much you can use SP800 to define just about any standard KDF that you need. HKDF, which is needed for TLS 1.3. And with that now, NSS, with NSS support for that, NSS is now able to do TLS 1.3 in FIPS mode, which is a big win for us. And finally, we added a new object type. So object types are typically things like your certs and your keys and stuff like that. We added something called profile objects. And with profile objects, we can now programmatically determine what profile you support. So you can advertise, I support the smart card profile, or I support a TLS particular profile. So as we define new profiles in our profile doc, programs can actually tell if you claim conformance to that profile programmatically now. Okay. So deployment. Did you want to take this one, Tony, or am I on this one still? Okay. PKCS 11.3.0 we released in June, and already a number of vendors have deployed some or all of PKCS 11 version 3. So Cryptsoft has it in their KMIP servers and in their SDKs. Encipher has in their 12.60, they have they're supporting some of the new mechanisms. NSS 3.53 has the full interface 3.0 interface working now. So both as a provider and as a user. So as tokens start supporting version 3, NSS will start using the version 3 interface. And with that, those interfaces are now available in RHEL 7.9z and RHEL 8.2z. So Red Hat is now shipping full PKCS 11 version 3 interfaces. Utamako Security Server 4.31 has some new mechanisms, and 4.40, I believe, has the interfaces. PKCS 11 version 3.1. So what are we doing next? We have new mechanisms coming. So HSS is our first post-quantum algorithm. HSS is one of the stateful hash algorithms, which is defined by the ITF. We have the KDF defined now, so that you can do things. You can do IKE and IPsec operations in your token. We've added new generators for TLS 1.3. So even though we added the HKDF, we didn't have the generator that TLS 1.3 used. So we've added that generator to PKCS to 3.1. One of the major features of 3.1 is XML test cases for the profiles. So I talked about we have the profile objects. Now we actually have test cases, XML test cases for those profiles. So profiles are starting to become more real in PKCS 11. And there's new, we're reorganizing the documents. We had split the documents up because of restrictions in certain versions of Word, and now those restrictions are gone. So Tony will talk about how we're going to reorganize those. So I will leave it to Tony now.
Thank you, Bob. Okay, so as Bob mentioned, part of this week coming in is the standardized XML test cases. So what that means is we start defining and better defining the profiles we have and adding new ones, where a profile effectively defines a subset of PKCS 11 content, a set of interactions between a consumer and a provider, and lays that out in sequence. I've got some examples coming, and basically within the PKCS 11 Technical Committee, we have agreed on a format of representing that in XML such that these test cases can be published, people can implement against them, and where we can actually start to see repeatable operations across multiple integrations or implementations, I should say. It does mean we can actually start doing proper testing, both interoperability testing and perhaps conformance testing. This has been problematic in the past, given the range of vendor extensions that Bob alluded to much earlier in this presentation. So it means going forward, we can actually start to build a far more interoperable set of implementations, knowing that they'll work together. And as I mentioned, this does deliver us a significant step towards being able to offer that kind of testing, which then flows down to the consumers of these technologies and how they might deploy them within their infrastructure. We've got some very basic examples. These were the ones that were used as part of the demonstration within the TC itself, how we started communicating about this concept. It's something that we've been doing in KMIP for a very long time, but bringing this across to PKCS 11, hopefully we can achieve the same kind of results as far as interoperability goes. So what we're seeing here is a very basic example with no variables. It's the actions required to obtain a random string. So you've got everything from the initialization, obtaining a slot, opening the session, obtaining the random, and then closing down the session. Moving forward, we can then start to see how this will work with variables. So it's effectively the same set of interactions, but you can start to see where we can throw variables in, which makes programmatic integration a little easier. You can actually see where those things start to bolt in. Okay, Bob also mentioned the documentation changes. So we have effectively, I mean, in a nutshell, we've gone back to roughly how things were at version 2.20 and draft 2.30. But to make it very clear, in the version 3.0 spec, you'll find the base specification and the current mechanisms. We also have the historical mechanisms. I'll get to that in a minute. But the main work as far as the documentation changes go involves the base spec and the current mechanisms. These previously were one document. They were split into two due to tooling mechanisms, shortcomings we had before. Those don't seem to be an issue anymore, so we've recombined them. We've pleasantly surprised it only capped out at about 422 pages, so not too heavy. Larger than we'd like, but hey, it covers a lot of ground. So effectively, there's a lot of commonalities between the base spec and current mechanisms. They've simply been merged with the mechanisms and conformance statements that were previously in 3.0 now occupying sections 6 and 7 of the new documentation. And going forward, this is just going to be the PKCS 11 specification. We've dropped all of the words around that. It's simply the spec. When we start looking at the documents as a set, this is I guess, a bit of a timeline for the major releases that we know where we're at the moment. So we can see the 4 documents down the left-hand side there. So we've got the base spec, current mechanisms, we've got the profiles that were introduced, as well as the historical mechanisms. We have those across version 2.40, version 3.0. There's also the base spec errata in there, but we won't go into that. Going forward from 3.1 onwards, we'll continue with the profiles. The historical mechanisms we will provide as and when needed. So basically, whenever we're moving a mechanism from current to historical, that document would get updated. We are we haven't made a decision on whether we'll do that as part of the 3.1 or not. That's still going on. I believe we probably won't publish the historical mechanisms for 3.1, but we may very well revisit that in 3.2. The important part there is the PKCS 11 specification, which is kicking in 3.1, and the base spec and current mechanisms will cease to exist beyond version 3.0. Okay, and moving back into the changes we have planned for 3.0, we're currently scoping these changes. The 3.1 scope is locked down. We're in documentation and finalization. 3.2, as far as the process goes, we are still scoping the content of that one, and I'll turn that back over to Bob now.
Okay, so there's a number of things that we didn't quite make it into 3.1 that we are going to pick up on 3.2. We're talking about asynchronous processing for keygen. This particularly becomes particularly interesting for the stateful hash algorithms, because it may take you days to generate a key. So this allows you to kick something off and come back later. We have some updates for the semantics on ECDH key wrap. FIPS 140-3 is creating a bunch of new requirements in a lot of tokens, including ours. Use the PKCS 11 interface as our FIPS module boundary. So we need to make sure that those changes can be implemented in PKCS 11. There's a lot more required programmatic indication of whether or not a particular algorithm has been FIPS validated, for instance, whether you're operating in FIPS mode. Those kinds of things. So we'll need to make some changes or additions to be able to provide that information in the same way, so all the vendors can so we don't have a bunch of vendor specific ways of doing those FIPS required changes. XMMS is another stateful hash algorithm. So we'll have a second one coming up in 3.0, and we'll be updating our profiles. These are the lists of things that we currently have slated. Depending on what comes up, some of these may or may not make it all the way to 3.0, but this is sort of where we're looking. This is not a complete list because it's still open. Other people can add new algorithms they want. So I think that's time for questions. So we can.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tony and Bob. That was great. Thank you very much. So we do have some questions here. We'll take them in the order that they came in. The first one is, will the XML test case definitions be generally available to the public? And is there code behind the definitions to issue actual PKCS 11 calls, or is it left to adopters to implement?
Do you want to handle that one, Bob?
I'll let you handle that one, Tony.
Okay. So please correct me. The XML test case definitions will be published. I'm unclear yet whether we're going to be publishing those as programmatic files. But certainly the work we do within the technical committee is absolutely open. That's the whole point of OASIS. So the XML test cases themselves, the definitions, yes, they'll be available programmatically. Unsure. We'll need to revisit that one. As far as the code behind the definitions, effectively, we've got a bunch of that in the header files. And I guess, Bob, do you want to talk to header files versus implementations?
Well, the header files hold all the definitions and the identifiers that we use in PKCS 11. We do keep that in a Git repository that we release with the specs. So Tony's list of specs, also the header files are in there. So if somebody were to donate a parser for the XML to open up and just call PKCS 11 modules, I'm sure as a technical committee, we would be willing to make that available.
Yeah, and certainly the with regards to specifically the XML, given that that is designed to test the implementation of specific profiles, it will only ever be a subset of PKCS 11. It is not intended to be a full representation of the entire specification. It is for the purpose of interoperability testing. Now, that said, if folks have particular profiles of usage they would like to submit to the technical committee, we would welcome them. And that's how things work in certainly in the KMIP TC. If folks have a profile of use that gets submitted, we have a look at that as a technical committee, figure out how we would implement that, and then and publish that as a profile with appropriate test cases. We seek to follow the same path with PKCS 11.
Good. So that kind of ties in with this next question. If I have a new algorithm I'd like to see referenced, how do I request this, and how long will it take to become available?
Okay. Basically, as far as the TC goes, well, we're back to how you work with OASIS. There are two methods to submit content to a technical committee. One is join the TC, get involved, have the discussions. I'm fortunate the TCs I've been involved in, both those where I'm serving roles and those where I just participate, tend to be populated with intelligent, articulate and lovely people. So it's a good community to join in. Should you not wish to do that or be unable to do that, each of the TCs has a comment list where you are able to provide suggestions or comments to the TC. We can then engage with you through that. And certainly we have a range of content that flows into the PKCS 11 TC each year from comments we received through that comments list. Bob, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, not much other than anything that you present now would currently be targeted for 3.2, since 3.1 is basically closed off and we're just working through the process of getting what we have out, which takes some time. So so we tend to work on these things sort of in parallel. So as 3.2 gets close to the point where we close it off, we will still take submissions, but they won't go into 3.2. So that's why XMSS is in 3.2. It came in too late to be able to put into 3.1, but we just roll it forward. We also tend to approve the wording as committee draft fairly quickly. So if you need it for implementation, we will have the IDs and stuff defined and they'll be in committee draft mode. So it's reasonably safe, though sometimes we run into interop issues that where it wasn't specified well enough that we would have to push that those specs down. But that happens sometimes even after we release.
Okay, so you know what, we're almost at 30 minutes, but let's take one more. And again, those that don't get answered, we can. I'm sorry.
There's also a question on the chat. I think somebody didn't realize Q&A was separate from chat.
Okay. You're right. So let's go with this one, but then let's take the one after this one too. So folks, please hang on a few more minutes. Is there any estimate on the timeline for the version 3.2 work?
At this stage, what we are trying to do as a TC is ramp up the cadence on releases. So there is a certain amount of public review and some built-in timelines in the publication process, which adds to the robustness of these standards documents. And trying to get out a publication in under 6 to 9 months, it's possible, it's tight, particularly once you're dealing with implementations and organizations. So at this stage, we are basically done with 3.1. We're in the final processes of checking it. And then we've got a bit of lag time in terms of going through the documentation stages and public reviews, etc. So we're looking at pushing 3.1 out. I'm really hopeful we can get sort of late Q1, early Q2 next year. We'll see how we go. Certainly, it will be out next year. There should be no reason that can't happen. With regards to 3.2 work, basically once we start down the road with the 3.1 publication process, we then pick up the technical work of defining 3.2. So look, my hope is we'd be targeting late 21, early 2022 for 3.2. But again, it depends on how much hurry up we're getting from the market and the amount of content we need to put in.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'd like to get to this last one. There might be another one. Okay, so I'm a little confused about PKCS 11 licensing with respect to the PKCS 11 headers. Let's clear that up.
Yeah, so am I. The good news is OASIS Legal has been working on how we can make that better. There's a push to try to figure out how we can get the headers in our PKCS 11 module or in our PKCS 11 working group licensed in a way that doesn't cause headaches to open source projects that they can look at it and say, yes, this will work. So it's actually going to be an OASIS wide look, but PKCS 11 header files are the first target of that. And those discussions are ongoing with first the chairs and then with the technical committee. So it hasn't been brought, proposals have not been brought to the technical committee yet, but there's movement afoot to try to solve this issue.
Yeah, and effectively the publication license exists already within the technical committee. We each have a set of IP rules we need to adhere to for each TC. So the license is implicit in those submission rules, which for PKCS 11 is RF on RAND. Oh, I believe it is. Sorry, I'll need to check that. Either way, it's implicit there, but perhaps it does need some clarification in terms of how that applies. So yeah, as Bob said, stay tuned. Dee, I think we've got one more question there from Matt Landrop.
Indeed we do, and we have a spellbound audience. So here we go. Could you help shed a bit more light on the storage objects and the idea intended scope of uniqueness, local versus global, as it pertains to such things as CKA _unique_ID. I would also be interested to hear your thoughts or ideas on where you see this as particularly applicable compared to previous versions.
Trying to remember what I think unique ID, by local or global, I presume you mean whether you mean within a token, instance of a token, or whether you mean CKA unique ID is unique across multiple tokens. And I think the spec specifies that, but I think it's local to the existing token, that if you try to move an object, its unique ID does change, or could potentially change. Tony, does that sound right?
Yeah,
This
we've
is a
covered
good
an awful
gym
lot of,
question.
yeah, we've covered an awful lot of ground since then. And it's ringing some bells. I just don't have the spec up in front of me at the moment. Too many screens to juggle. But certainly, I know some of that conversation. I'll avoid storage objects, but as far as CK unique ID goes, the intent there is to have that mirror what we're doing in KMIP, because we're actually moving as a technical committee. We're working with the KMIP technical committee to effectively use KMIP as the standardized network transport for the standardized crypto APIs of PKCS 11. And within KMIP, every object has a unique ID, and that is unique to the system that is being implemented. So, or perhaps any other systems that it might come in contact with. So, ensuring global uniqueness, you can somewhat do that, and we're looking at that. But certainly, from a KMIP perspective, it's unique to the system. Once we start reflecting PKCS 11 across KMIP as a network transport, we need to be able to reflect that level of uniqueness. So, at this point, I think it was certainly within the token. I believe we were aiming to move that to within the actual implementation. So perhaps across multiple tokens. I don't think we've extended out to full global yet, because that would require a different form. And I don't think we've covered that ground yet, but I might be mistaken. I don't have the spec up in front of me.
Yeah, it is meant to mirror the KMIP notion of unique ID, which the CKA ID was not sufficient for.
Okay, so I'm going to, again, folks are still with us, which is awesome. So I'm going to kind of munge a couple of these together. So the first part of it is, how can I encourage vendors to move from older versions, and how fast are vendors moving to the OASIS standards?
Awesome. I love how long's a bit of string questions. So in terms of encouraging folks to move forward, there's a couple of things there. It's usually market pressure and competitiveness that prompts organizations to move forward, to stay current with their peers. Of more relevance to us in the current day and age, effectively, and Bob mentioned this earlier, we've got a whole range of mechanisms that hadn't been added in the hiatus between when the IP moved from RSA over to OASIS. So we had a fair bit of catch up to do, and we've still got to keep going. So it's the security capability within PKCS 11, staying relevant to, the current algorithms and mechanisms. And as Bob mentioned, we're working pretty hard to pull in a range of post-quantum algorithms into version 3.2. So, that should be incentive enough, is to stay relevant from a security standpoint. And if you're a consumer of these products, go lean on your vendors, ask them why they aren't moving forward, why they aren't offering these capabilities. Bob talked about a range of implementations that offer V3 capability. Now, implementing the full spec for every implementation, that's a big ask. Some have, some haven't. But certainly the bits that are relevant for their market sector, for their product type, for their chosen product feature set, that's entirely reasonable. So it's an iterative process. As implementations need to build these out, they get added in. So effectively, the answer is market pressure.
Yeah, and it will be a competitive advantage for a vendor to be on 3.0. If you're running on those new versions of NSS and you have the old version and you're implementing AES, your implementation is going to be slower, because we're using single shot instead of the message interface. And it may not even work in FIPS mode. So there's, if for instance, if you want to support NSS and FIPS mode on doing TLS 1.3, you will have to use the version 3 spec, because there isn't another way of doing it. So you'll be feature deficient in your token if you aren't on V3 for running on modern software. And you can see by the uptake that a lot of vendors have already started moving to 3.0 in 6. The spec's been out in 6 months, and already vendors are shipping stuff. So.
And part of the advantage, or part of the reasoning behind introducing the XML test cases we covered earlier, is also to allow members of the TC to speed up their deployment of PKCS 11 and actually test them before we finalise a version of the spec. Certainly that's the way we run things in KMIP, or we try to, is we actually do testing before we finalise that version of the spec so that, hey, we know this stuff works. Slightly different scenario when you're dealing with APIs versus protocols, but the same drivers apply. And basically, once a lot of those same vendors that are doing the work in the TC are also shipping products, so those products hit the market sooner.
That's great. So that pretty much deals with the interoperability between implementations. Okay, so let's just finish with this one. And I think this is important, and we can send it along in the follow-up email. Is there a register of known implementations and what versions they support?
Not at this stage, or at least certainly not an up-to-date one. We have discussed putting that on the wiki. I think we even have an entry on the wiki for that. But it is a wiki, so it requires people to update it.
Right.
And trying to keep track of all of these things, a definitive list is almost an impossible ask. A realistic list of common implementations, that's not too difficult. So in terms of how we do that, yes, certainly we'd like to keep I guess a wiki entry up to date with those we know about. The other side of that is once we actually get more of the XML-based test cases running and the profiles running, we expand that set and then start doing interoperability tests and plug fests, we can actually start to make those results public, similar to what we do with KMIP. So you can go back and see over the years, who's participated in what test and what versions they support. It'll take us a little while to get that ramped up, but the vision is the same there.
Okay, terrific. So let this just act as an open invitation for all those folks that are on the call. We would love to have you join us. It certainly makes it the more people we have working on this, the better it will be. Again, we'll follow up after the webinar. If you have specific questions for Tony or Bob, we could get you in touch with them. We'll give you their contact information. Tony, Bob, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time to do this. This has been fantastic. Thanks again. You were great.
Been a pleasure. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.
Bye now.